Did he really just say that about his own sister? The room went silent the moment Daniel Carter lifted his glass, his smile sharp enough to cut through the warm glow of the upscale hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago. It was supposed to be a celebration, the kind of night where polished suits, clinking glasses, and congratulatory speeches filled the air, but for Emily Carter it felt like stepping into a stage she was never meant to stand on. Daniel had just been promoted to senior project manager at a fast-growing tech firm, the kind of success their family had always expected from him, the kind that made their parents beam with pride every time his name was mentioned. Emily, on the other hand, had arrived alone, wearing a simple navy dress she had chosen carefully to look appropriate but not attention-seeking. Already aware of how conversations tended to shift when she entered a room full of people who knew her only through fragmented stories of career changes and uncertainty. She stood slightly apart from the center of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching Daniel effortlessly command attention as colleagues, managers, and family friends gathered around him like he was the center of gravity. The Carter family had always valued achievement above everything else, and in their unspoken hierarchy, Daniel stood at the top, while Emily occupied a quieter, less defined space that people politely referred to as figuring things out. She had heard variations of that phrase for years, each one sounding softer on the surface but heavier underneath, like expectations carefully wrapped in disappointment. Tonight, however, something felt different, almost staged, as if her presence had been noted in advance and subtly woven into the evening's undercurrent. Daniel's laughter carried across the room again, louder this time, drawing attention back to him as he tapped a fork against his glass for attention. "Before I forget," he said, leaning slightly forward with a grin that suggested he was about to share something amusing rather than personal, "I just want to thank everyone for coming, especially my family who supported me through everything, even when some of us were, well, still trying to figure out basic job stability." A few polite laughs rippled through the crowd, unsure whether they were supposed to join in or not, and Emily felt her fingers tighten slightly around her glass. She didn't look at him yet, not immediately, because she already knew what direction this was heading. Daniel continued, enjoying the attention, his confidence growing with every second. "Honestly," he added, glancing briefly in her direction for the first time that evening, "it's been a wild year. Some of us got promoted, some of us got fired again. But hey, that's life, right?" The last words landed with a softness that made them sound almost harmless, but the meaning behind them spread quickly through the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Emily finally looked up, meeting the eyes of people she had known since childhood, neighbors, family friends, even a few colleagues of Daniel's who were now trying very hard not to react too openly. In that moment, she realized it wasn't just a careless joke, it was a deliberate spotlight, carefully aimed. The chandeliers above them continued to glow warmly. The jazz music in the background didn't stop, and the waitstaff kept moving between tables as if nothing had changed. But for Emily, the room had shifted into something else entirely, something quieter, heavier, and far more revealing than anyone around her seemed willing to acknowledge. Emily Carter did not respond immediately, and that silence was far more uncomfortable than any argument could have been. The faint sound of glasses clinking and soft laughter around her continued, as if nothing unusual had happened, yet she could feel the subtle shift in body language from the nearest table, people leaning in just slightly, as if waiting to see whether she would react, shrink, or somehow confirm the story that had just been told about her. Daniel Carter, still standing near the head of the room, maintained his relaxed posture, one hand in his pocket, the other resting casually near his glass, as if he had merely shared a harmless anecdote, instead of placing his own sister under public scrutiny. Their parents were seated a few feet away at a reserved table, exchanging brief glances that carried more meaning than words, the kind of look that tried to maintain appearances while quietly avoiding involvement. Emily finally lowered her gaze to her drink, noticing the faint reflection of the chandelier light trembling slightly in the glass. And in that moment she became aware of how controlled everything around her felt, from the carefully arranged floral centerpieces to the scripted rhythm of the evening itself. A server passed by offering appetizers, and she politely declined without looking up, her voice steady in a way that surprised even herself. Across the room, Daniel had already shifted his attention back to the group surrounding him, as if the moment had served its purpose and no further acknowledgement was necessary. Conversations gradually resumed, but not with the same ease as before, because now there was an invisible thread connecting every glance toward Emily, a quiet curiosity that no one openly admitted. Someone near her whispered a comment under their breath, something sympathetic but awkward, and she pretended not to hear it, focusing instead on the polished wooden edge of the table beside her. She had been in uncomfortable rooms before, interviews that did not go well, meetings that ended with polite rejection, and conversations where people tried to soften disappointment with carefully chosen words. But this felt different because it was not private failure. It was shared perception being shaped in real time. Daniel laughed again at something one of his colleagues said, the sound carrying easily across the space, reinforcing the image of confidence and success that the evening was built around. Emily noticed how effortlessly people responded to him, how quickly the room adjusted itself around his presence, and how little resistance there was to the narrative being presented. A distant memory surfaced briefly, of a different time when Daniel had once asked her for help reviewing a presentation late at night, when things had not yet been divided so clearly into winners and others still trying to catch up. She pushed the memory aside gently, not out of anger, but because it no longer seemed useful in a room like this. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand, a notification lighting up the screen for only a moment before she turned it face down on the table, not ready to engage with anything outside this space yet. The music changed to a slower instrumental piece, and the lighting in the ballroom seemed to dim just slightly, making the room feel even more enclosed despite its size. Daniel raised his glass again for another toast, this time thanking a senior executive who had attended the event, and the attention of the room shifted smoothly back toward him, leaving Emily in a quieter pocket of space that felt almost intentional in its isolation. She exhaled slowly, not dramatically, not visibly, but with a measured calm that did not match the tension around her. And for the first time since arriving, she began to understand that the evening was not simply a celebration of achievement, but a stage where perception mattered more than truth. The atmosphere in the ballroom had settled into a strange balance, where celebration continued on the surface while something quieter and more calculated moved underneath it. Emily Carter remained in her position near the edge of the room, but her awareness of everything around her had sharpened in a way that made every sound feel more distinct, from the soft scrape of chair legs against polished floor to the controlled rhythm of conversations that rose and fell like waves designed to avoid any single point of focus. Daniel Carter was now fully immersed in his role as the guest of honor, moving between small groups with ease, shaking hands, exchanging professional compliments, and maintaining the kind of effortless confidence that made people naturally gravitate toward him. His earlier comment about Emily no longer lingered in his behavior, as if it had been just another passing remark, yet its effect remained embedded in the room like an invisible layer that subtly influenced how people looked at her when they thought she was not noticing. Emily, however, was noticing everything, not in an emotional or reactive way, but with a growing sense of clarity that came from stepping outside the immediate pressure of the moment. She observed how quickly attention shifted whenever Daniel spoke, how even slight changes in his tone could redirect the energy of entire conversations, and how little room there was in this environment for anything that did not align with the narrative of success being presented. A nearby group of guests laughed at something Daniel said, and the sound carried across the room just enough for Emily to catch fragments of praise and admiration, words like impressive trajectory and well-deserved promotion blending into the background like familiar echoes. One of Daniel's colleagues, a man in his mid-30s wearing a tailored gray suit, briefly glanced toward Emily while speaking to someone else, his expression uncertain, as if trying to reconcile the image of the confident professional being described with the quiet figure standing alone near the side of the room. Emily adjusted her posture slightly, not to draw attention, but simply to remain steady as the evening continued to unfold without requiring her participation. Her mind was not racing, but processing, connecting small details that had previously felt unrelated. The way Daniel had insisted she attend, the way certain guests had been subtly informed of her presence, and the way her own achievements, or lack of publicly recognized ones, had become an unspoken topic that others seemed comfortable interpreting without asking her directly. Across the room, Daniel's voice rose again as he introduced another senior guest, and the attention of the room followed him smoothly, almost instinctively, like a well-rehearsed sequence. Emily noticed how even her parents seemed more comfortable when the focus was away from her. Their expressions relaxed when they could simply participate in applause or polite laughter rather than navigate the complexity of her position in the conversation. A waiter approached Emily again with a tray of drinks, and this time she accepted a glass of sparkling water without hesitation, not because she needed it, but because it gave her something tangible to hold while she continued observing. The liquid inside caught the light as she turned slightly, and she realized that the discomfort she felt was not confusion or surprise, but recognition of a pattern she had experienced in smaller ways before, now amplified by the scale of the room. Daniel, meanwhile, had begun a brief speech of gratitude, his voice steady and confident as he thanked mentors, colleagues, and family members for their support, carefully constructing a version of his journey that felt clean, linear, and undeniably successful. Emily listened without interrupting, not because she agreed, but because she was beginning to understand that tonight was not about dialogue. It was about narrative control, and in that structure, silence could carry more weight than response. When Daniel paused for applause, the room responded immediately, filling the space with sound that felt both celebratory and reinforcing. And in that moment, Emily made a small, but important realization that whatever came next in this evening, she was no longer just a guest observing from the outside. She had become part of the story being told, whether she chose it or not. The rhythm of the evening had shifted again, not in any dramatic or visible way, but in the subtle recalibration that happens when attention begins to concentrate on a single unresolved tension. Emily Carter could feel it in the way conversations nearby occasionally slowed when she moved slightly, or in how certain guests now avoided standing directly beside her, as if unsure whether proximity required acknowledgement of what had already been said earlier. Daniel Carter's speech had ended with another round of applause, and the energy in the ballroom had briefly surged before settling into smaller clusters of discussion, yet the undercurrent of curiosity had not disappeared. Instead, it had evolved, becoming quieter, more observational, as people began to revisit earlier moments in their minds with a new layer of interpretation. Emily remained composed, holding her glass with both hands now, not because she was nervous, but because it anchored her in a space that increasingly felt like it was shifting around her rather than remaining stable. Daniel had moved back into the crowd, receiving congratulations and handshakes, his posture relaxed, his expression confident, as if the earlier exchange that had drawn attention to Emily was already behind him and no longer relevant to the atmosphere he intended to maintain. Yet Emily noticed something different in how a few people interacted with him now. A slight hesitation before laughing, a brief glance toward her before responding to his remarks, as if fragments of context had begun to reassemble themselves in their minds. A woman seated near the center table, someone who had been laughing earlier without hesitation, now spoke more softly when Daniel approached, her tone slightly more measured, as though recalibrating her understanding of the dynamic she had witnessed. Emily did not engage in these shifts outwardly, but she registered them with increasing precision, like observing small structural changes in a building that only reveal themselves when pressure is redistributed. Her phone remained face down on the table beside her, untouched, though it had vibrated twice earlier, each time breaking her focus for only a second before she chose not to respond. The ballroom lighting remained warm, but it no longer felt comforting. Instead, it emphasized contrast, highlighting polished surfaces, tailored clothing, and carefully maintained expressions that all contributed to the illusion of effortless success. Daniel's voice could still be heard occasionally rising above the ambient noise as he moved from group to group, but it no longer anchored the room in the same way it had earlier. Something had subtly changed in how people listened to him, not openly, not in a way that would be noticeable to someone not paying attention, but enough to alter the rhythm of response. Emily noticed a senior guest, someone who had earlier praised Daniel's promotion, now pausing slightly before responding to him, as if mentally reviewing something unspoken. Her parents remained seated at their table, their posture more rigid than before, their earlier comfort replaced with a cautious awareness that did not yet translate into action. Emily's attention briefly drifted to the center of the room, where a projection screen displayed a looping presentation of Daniel's professional achievements, graphs and milestones designed to reinforce the celebratory narrative of the evening. The visuals were clean and carefully curated, emphasizing progress and recognition. But as Emily studied them, she noticed how easily such presentations could omit context, how absence could be just as influential as presence in shaping perception. A server passed by again, this time offering coffee, and Emily accepted without looking up, taking a small sip as she continued observing the shifting dynamics around her. Daniel was now speaking with a group that included one of his managers, his tone slightly more animated, but Emily caught a brief moment where the manager's expression changed subtly, as if recalling something unexpected. It lasted only a second, but it was enough for Emily to sense that the evening's narrative was no longer as tightly controlled as it had been earlier. People were beginning to notice inconsistencies, small gaps between what was being celebrated and what was being remembered. Emily did not intervene, did not speak, and did not attempt to redirect attention, because she was beginning to understand that the structure of the room itself was doing something she no longer needed to participate in directly. Instead, she simply remained present, steady, and observant, as the carefully constructed atmosphere around Daniel began to develop the first faint signs of imbalance that no longer required her to create, only to witness. The atmosphere in the ballroom had begun to feel subtly uneven, as if the structure of the evening was still intact on the surface, but no longer perfectly aligned underneath it. Emily Carter remained near the edge of the room, her presence quiet but increasingly central in ways that were not immediately spoken aloud, while Daniel Carter continued moving through conversations that once flowed effortlessly but now carried faint pauses that did not exist earlier in the night. It was not a visible collapse or an obvious confrontation, but a gradual shift in attention, the kind that happens when people begin to mentally revisit what they have already heard and quietly compare it with what they believe they know. Emily noticed it first in the smallest reactions, a slight hesitation before laughter, a momentary pause before agreement, a glance that flickered toward her and then away too quickly to be acknowledged openly. Daniel was still performing the role of the confident host of the evening, his tone steady, his gestures controlled, but the effortless dominance of attention he had held earlier now required more effort, as if the room itself was no longer automatically following his lead. A senior colleague who had previously congratulated him with enthusiasm now responded with a more measured tone, nodding slightly longer before speaking, as though weighing his words more carefully than before. Emily did not move from her position, but her awareness expanded outward, tracking how conversations near her seemed to slowly orbit around unresolved curiosity. A few guests who had earlier treated her presence as background detail now occasionally looked in her direction without speaking, as if trying to reconcile something they had missed. Daniel, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the change in atmosphere, continued engaging with groups of people near the central tables, occasionally laughing, occasionally emphasizing points about teamwork and leadership, but the responses he received were no longer as immediate or uniform as they had been earlier in the evening. Emily took another small sip of her drink, her expression unchanged, yet internally observing how quickly perception could shift without any formal announcement or visible trigger. The projection screen behind the main seating area continued to cycle through images of Daniel's professional milestones, but even those visuals now felt slightly disconnected from the evolving mood of the room, as if they belonged to an earlier version of the evening that was no longer fully aligned with the present moment. A few guests near the back of the room had begun speaking in lower voices, their conversations no longer focused solely on celebration, but drifting toward interpretation, revisiting earlier remarks with new attention to detail. Emily noticed how information did not need to be corrected directly to begin changing shape in people's minds. It only needed to be reconsidered in silence. Daniel briefly raised his glass again in response to another congratulatory remark, but this time the applause that followed felt slightly shorter, slightly more contained, as if the emotional momentum of the evening was beginning to distribute itself unevenly across the room. Emily's parents exchanged another brief glance, this time more uncertain than before, Their earlier attempt to maintain smooth participation now replaced with a quiet awareness that the social balance around them was no longer predictable. Emily did not seek attention, did not reposition herself, and did not attempt to influence the unfolding atmosphere, because she was beginning to understand that the situation was no longer driven by a single voice or a single narrative, but by the collective recalibration of everyone present. Even Daniel, in moments between conversations, seemed to sense a subtle change, though he continued forward without pause, maintaining the structure of the evening as best as he could. Yet the room had already begun to shift in ways that no longer depended entirely on him, and Emily, standing calmly at the edge of that shift, remained the quiet point around which attention was slowly, and almost imperceptibly, beginning to reorganize itself. The ballroom no longer felt like a unified celebration, but rather like a collection of smaller, fragmented conversations that were slowly beginning to reference the same underlying uncertainty. Emily Carter remained in her position near the edge of the room, still quiet, still observant, but now there was a noticeable difference in how the space responded around her presence, as if she had become a reference point that people were subconsciously orienting themselves toward without openly acknowledging it. Daniel Carter continued to move through the crowd, but the rhythm of his interactions had changed in subtle ways that were difficult to ignore if one was paying attention. Conversations that once flowed smoothly now included brief pauses, slight repetitions of phrases, and moments where listeners seemed to mentally check what they had just heard against something they were beginning to reconsider. Emily did not intervene or change her behavior in any visible way, yet she could sense how attention was no longer fully anchored to Daniel as it had been earlier in the evening. A senior guest who had previously spoken with certainty about Daniel's achievements now asked a question with a more cautious tone, and although the question itself was simple, the timing of it created a noticeable shift in the surrounding group. Daniel responded immediately, maintaining composure, but for the first time that night, there was a fraction of a second where his answer did not fully restore the previous energy of the conversation. Emily noticed this not as a dramatic moment, but as a structural one, like a small imbalance in a system that had been operating too smoothly for too long. Around the room, similar micro-adjustments were happening in different clusters of guests, each one small enough to be dismissed individually, but collectively forming a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. A few people near the central tables began speaking more quietly, their attention no longer fully directed at Daniel, but occasionally shifting toward Emily, as if trying to place her within a context that had not been fully explained earlier. Daniel, however, continued engaging with confidence, occasionally laughing, occasionally emphasizing key points about leadership and growth, yet even his laughter now seemed to require slightly more reinforcement from those around him. Emily took another slow sip of her drink, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But internally, she was observing how quickly perception could evolve once it stopped being reinforced by repetition. The projection screen behind the main area continued displaying images from Daniel's professional presentation, but the contrast between the polished visuals and the shifting attention in the room made the presentation feel increasingly disconnected from the lived reality of the moment. A few guests who had earlier congratulated Daniel with enthusiasm now exchanged brief comments that were less declarative and more reflective, as if they were trying to reconcile earlier impressions with newly emerging information. Emily noticed how none of this required confrontation or explanation. It was happening entirely through observation, memory, and subtle reevaluation. Her parents remained seated at their table, their earlier attempts at social ease now replaced by quiet vigilance, their attention divided between maintaining appearances and trying to understand the direction in which the evening was moving. Daniel paused briefly near the center of the room, speaking to a small group that included one of his managers, and for a moment the conversation seemed to stabilize, but then a slight hesitation in the manager's response introduced another small shift in tone. Emily did not react outwardly. Yet she recognized that the stability Daniel had relied on earlier in the evening was no longer automatically sustained by the room itself. The environment was beginning to require continuous reinforcement to maintain its original narrative, and even small interruptions in that reinforcement were becoming more noticeable. As the evening progressed, the ballroom did not descend into chaos or confrontation, but instead entered a more complex state where attention, memory, and interpretation were no longer perfectly aligned, and Emily Carter, still standing quietly at the edge of it all, remained the point around which that gradual reconfiguration continued to unfold. The atmosphere in the ballroom had reached a point where the original structure of the evening no longer felt fully intact, yet nothing had officially changed enough for anyone to openly acknowledge it. Emily Carter remained in her position near the edge of the room, still calm, still observant, but now the space around her felt different in a way that was no longer subtle. It was as if the collective awareness of the guests had quietly reorganized itself around a set of details that had not been fully processed earlier. Daniel Carter was still moving through conversations, still speaking with confidence, still receiving polite responses, but the rhythm of those interactions had shifted into something less automatic and more evaluative. Emily noticed how people no longer responded purely to his words, but also to pauses between them, as if searching for consistency in what they had been told versus what they were beginning to notice. A few guests who had previously laughed without hesitation now offered only brief smiles before looking away, their attention drifting momentarily toward Emily before returning to Daniel, as though they were subconsciously comparing two narratives that no longer aligned perfectly. Daniel continued to speak with one of his senior managers near the central table, his posture steady, his tone controlled, but even from a distance, Emily could sense that the exchange had become more careful, more measured, with fewer immediate affirmations than before. The manager nodded at appropriate moments, yet there was a slight delay in response that did not exist earlier in the evening, a hesitation that suggested reconsideration rather than agreement. Emily did not move or attempt to draw attention, yet she could feel how the room was no longer treating her as background presence. Instead, she had become a silent reference point in the minds of multiple guests, not because she had spoken more, but because earlier statements about her were now being mentally re-examined in the absence of complete certainty. The projection screen continued to display Daniel's professional highlights, but the visuals no longer fully dominated attention, as small clusters of guests began forming quieter side conversations that occasionally referenced earlier moments in the evening. Emily noticed how often her name was not spoken directly, but implied through pauses, glances, and carefully chosen words that avoided explicit mention while still circling the same idea. Her parents sat at their table with increasingly restrained expressions, their earlier attempt to maintain social ease replaced by a quiet awareness that the narrative of the evening was no longer entirely under predictable control. Daniel, however, still maintained forward momentum, transitioning from one group to another, reinforcing his professional image through repetition and presence. Yet even his confidence now required a more deliberate effort to sustain the same level of response. At one point, a brief silence followed one of his remarks, slightly longer than expected, and although it was quickly filled by another guest, the moment remained noticeable in the collective memory of those nearby. Emily took another small sip of her drink, her expression unchanged, but her attention increasingly focused on the structure of perception itself rather than individual comments or reactions. She observed how quickly certainty could become unstable when enough small inconsistencies accumulated without resolution. The room itself, once clearly oriented around Daniel's achievement, was now operating in a more distributed state, where attention was no longer centralized but shared across multiple points of focus, with Emily quietly occupying one of those points without actively competing for it. Daniel briefly glanced across the room in her direction while speaking, not stopping, not changing tone, but the glance itself carried a fraction of awareness that the dynamic had shifted. Emily did not return the gaze for long, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing in that moment that required reaction. The evening continued, but its internal logic had already begun to evolve, and what remained was no longer a simple celebration of success, but a gathering in which perception itself had become unstable enough that everyone present was now participating in its silent recalibration. The ballroom had reached a state where the original celebration no longer functioned as a single unified experience, but instead existed as overlapping layers of perception that were constantly adjusting themselves in real time. Emily Carter remained near the edge of the room, still composed, still quiet, but now fully aware that the attention around her had stabilized into something more deliberate rather than accidental. Daniel Carter continued to speak with guests, yet the responses he received were no longer uniformly immediate, and the subtle variations in reaction had begun to accumulate into a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Conversations that once reinforced his position of confidence now carried a slightly more reflective tone, as if each listener was mentally reprocessing earlier assumptions before fully committing to agreement. Emily observed how easily the structure of perception could be influenced not by new information alone, but by the reordering of attention itself. A few guests near the central tables were now less focused on celebrating and more engaged in quiet comparison, revisiting earlier moments in the evening with a level of scrutiny that had not been present before. Daniel's movements through the room remained steady, his tone consistent, his presence still commanding, but the automatic reinforcement that had supported his narrative earlier in the night was no longer functioning in the same way. Emily noticed that even when people responded positively to him, there was now a brief internal delay, a fraction of hesitation that suggested they were no longer receiving his words in isolation. Instead, every statement seemed to exist alongside an unspoken context that had begun to surface gradually throughout the evening. The projection screen continued displaying polished images of Daniel's professional achievements, yet these visuals now appeared less dominant, as if competing with a parallel stream of interpretation taking place among the guests. Emily took another slow sip of her drink, her attention shifting between small clusters of conversation that were no longer entirely synchronized with the official tone of the event. Her parents remained seated, their expressions increasingly restrained, their earlier attempt at maintaining social stability replaced by a quiet awareness that the evening was no longer following a predictable trajectory. Daniel paused briefly during a conversation with a senior executive, and although the exchange continued smoothly afterward, Emily noticed that the pause had been long enough for multiple guests nearby to register it as significant. That single moment, while subtle, seemed to echo differently across the room, not because it was dramatic, but because it disrupted the consistency that had been assumed earlier. Emily did not change her position or expression, yet she could feel how attention was no longer simply directed toward Daniel as a central figure, but was instead distributed across a wider field of observation that included her presence more directly than before. People were no longer reacting solely to what was being said, but also to what had been previously implied, reconsidered, and partially understood. Daniel continued to maintain his composure, speaking with confidence, engaging with multiple groups, and reinforcing his role within the event. Yet even his strongest interactions now required more sustained effort to achieve the same level of response that had come naturally earlier. Emily noticed how quickly certainty could lose its stability once it was no longer continuously reinforced by unanimous perception. A few guests who had previously dismissed her presence entirely were now occasionally glancing in her direction with a more neutral expression, neither supportive nor dismissive, but observational, as if trying to place her within a revised understanding of the evening. The shift was not dramatic, but it was persistent, and it did not require confrontation or explanation to continue developing. Emily remained still, not as an act of resistance or engagement, but as a point of consistency within an environment that was slowly recalibrating itself. Daniel's voice carried again across the room as he concluded another brief exchange, and the response he received was polite, but not as immediate or uniform as before. In that moment, the structure of the evening had fully transitioned from a simple celebration into a complex field of shifting interpretation, where every participant was now quietly reevaluating what they believed they had already understood. The ballroom had settled into a quieter, more reflective version of itself, where the celebration still continued on the surface but no longer dictated the emotional direction of the room. Emily Carter remained near the edge, her presence steady and unchanged, yet now she was no longer simply observing the environment. She had become an unavoidable reference point within it. Daniel Carter stood closer to the center, still engaged in conversation, still maintaining his composed posture and confident tone, but the consistency of attention that had once surrounded him had clearly fragmented. Guests were no longer responding to him with the same immediate certainty. and even when they smiled or nodded, there was a brief pause that suggested interpretation had replaced instinct. Emily noticed how the room had stopped operating as a single narrative and instead functioned as multiple overlapping interpretations of the same evening, each one slightly different, depending on who was paying attention. Daniel continued speaking with a senior executive near the central table, his voice steady and controlled. Yet Emily observed a subtle change in how the executive responded, not openly disagreeing, not visibly challenging, but no longer reinforcing the same level of affirmation as before. That small shift carried through the surrounding group like a quiet ripple, changing the tone of nearby conversations without requiring any direct acknowledgement. Emily's parents remained seated, their posture composed but noticeably more restrained. Their earlier attempt to maintain smooth participation now replaced by a careful awareness that the social balance of the evening was no longer predictable or centralized. Emily did not move or intervene, but she could feel how attention around her had stabilized into a more conscious form, as if people were now actively aware of her presence rather than passively ignoring it. Daniel's voice rose briefly as he concluded another exchange, and polite applause followed, but it was shorter and less unified than earlier moments in the evening, lacking the same automatic cohesion that had previously defined the atmosphere. Emily observed how quickly collective certainty could weaken once it was no longer continuously reinforced, and how perception itself could shift without any formal announcement or visible turning point. A few guests near the back of the room exchanged quiet remarks, their expressions thoughtful rather than reactive, as if they were now constructing their understanding of the evening in real time rather than relying on the narrative that had been presented at the beginning. Daniel moved to another group, continuing to engage with confidence, but even his strongest interactions now seemed to require additional effort to sustain the same level of response. Emily noticed how attention was no longer flowing toward him automatically, but instead circulating more broadly across the room, occasionally returning to her without prompting. When she was glanced at, it was no longer with dismissal or confusion, but with a measured awareness, as if her role in the evening had been quietly redefined without anyone openly stating it. The projection screen continued to display polished achievements and milestones, but its influence had diminished as guests increasingly focused on the immediate dynamics of the room rather than the curated presentation behind it. Emily took another small sip of her drink, her expression unchanged, but her understanding of the situation had become more precise, not emotional, but structural, as she recognized that the evening was no longer being shaped by a single dominant perspective. Daniel paused briefly during a conversation, and although he resumed speaking without hesitation, the brief interruption had already been registered by multiple observers, each interpreting it in their own way. That accumulation of small moments created a final, subtle transition in the room's atmosphere, where certainty had been replaced by ongoing reassessment, and where Emily Carter, still standing calmly at the edge of the ballroom, had become an established point of awareness within a gathering that could no longer fully return to its original narrative.